Good morning, and welcome to today's Atlantic Council event, Combating Food Insecurity and Malnutrition, a National Security Imperative. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm the Vice President of the Atlantic Council and Senior Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. We gather here today to discuss an urgent and growing threat to global security, extreme hunger and malnutrition. Around the world, more than 345 million people are experiencing severe food insecurity, with nearly 800 million facing chronic hunger. The COVID-19 pandemic, war, corruption, demographic shifts, climate change, and other challenges have exacerbated this crisis, destabilizing global food systems. The international community is losing hard-won gains in the fight against hunger, especially in fragile states and already vulnerable regions of the world. In his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, Putin has used access to food as a weapon of war, reminding us all of the connection between food security and national security. This is a humanitarian tragedy and a threat to international stability. To combat this challenge, the international community must design impactful interventions and build more resilient food and health systems that can withstand shocks and emerging threats. Now more than ever, combating global hunger is a national security imperative, and it demands solutions that bring together humanitarian and national security leaders in common cause. To discuss these issues today, we'll be joined by an impressive group of experts, including U.S. Senator Cory Booker, former National Security Advisor General James Jones, Farah Barrios, Director for Global Food Security and Development at the National Security Council, former Commander of U.S. Africa Command General Kip Ward, William Moore, CEO of the Eleanor Crook Foundation, and Johanna Mendelsohn Foreman, Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center, and the panel will be moderated by Nicole Golden with Apt Associates and the Atlantic Council. Convenings on topics such as this are central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The Center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. We're delighted to be joined here today by our event partner, the Eleanor Crook Foundation, and our esteemed group of speakers. Now, I'll turn the floor over to our first speaker, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, who's joining us via video. Senator Booker serves on both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. Last year, Senator Booker led a bipartisan resolution condemning the use of hunger as a weapon of war and recognizing the effect of conflict on global food security and famine following Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry that my duties in the Senate prevent me from being with you all in person at this very important event. I want to thank the Atlantic Council and, of course, the Eleanor Crook Foundation for bringing together such important stakeholders and experts for the discussion on ways we can address the global hunger crisis, and especially at this critically important moment in history. Due to increasingly destructive natural disasters, the after effects of COVID-19, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and more, the world is facing the worst hunger crisis since World War II. The stats are dire. 345 million people are facing acute hunger around the world, nearly double from before the COVID-19 pandemic. And most alarmingly, hundreds of thousands of people are facing catastrophic hunger, famine-like conditions in places like Mali, Somalia, and South Sudan. I've worked closely on this issue with my good friend Cindy McCain. I'm so grateful for her. She's the head of the World Food Program, as you know, and she has made us aware that the World Food Program will require significant additional assistance in the coming months. Right now, the World Food Program is facing a shortfall of $8.6 billion over just the next 6 months. The more than 60% funding shortfall this year was the highest in the World Food Program's 60-year history. If this continues, the World Food Program will have to cut assistance to millions of vulnerable people. And the progress that we've made in several regions, such as the Horn of Africa and Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, will be lost. This is a moral urgency. As the United Nations has said, enough food is produced each year to feed everyone on the planet. There's no reason that a child or a family should go hungry. And when they do, it should compel all of us to act. Global food security is a national security issue. As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I believe we are caught in that inescapable network of mutuality, that we are indeed tied in a common garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly will affect us all indirectly. And so if we leave this crisis unaddressed, it will contribute to mass migration, to more conflict, to more instability that will make our challenges even worse. The first step, of course, is to meet the immediate short-term needs of those suffering from food insecurity. Last year, we came together here in the Senate and in Congress in a bipartisan fashion to include $5 billion in emergency global food aid in a supplemental funding bill for Ukraine. I'm proud of that. I'm working with Congress right now to continue the bipartisan work, but we face an uphill climb. So now more than ever, we need to build a broad coalition of support for providing emergency food assistance to people around the globe who are facing malnutrition and starvation. Our coalition needs to include U.S. farmers and the shipping industry and those stakeholders who will be with us if we focus on in the near term, on purchasing U.S. commodities and sending them to people in need of life-saving assistance. And our coalition needs to include voices from the national security community, advocates like you, who can talk about why providing food to those in desperate need is not just charity, but critical for the United States and our own national security. In addition to emergency food assistance, we must also think about and address the long-term factors that are contributing to food insecurity. That means investing in agricultural resiliency programs or agricultural research and development projects. Those gains may be hard to measure year to year, but over time, the impact can be transformative. For every dollar invested in building resilience through multi-sectoral food security programs, $3 is saved in more expensive humanitarian assistance. Again, these investments are not just the right thing to do, they will also help promote national security and are the economical thing to do. By funding trusted and proven life-saving programs, we can stave off not only hunger, but also radicalization, global instability, and future conflict. Just 2 days ago, we celebrated World Food Day. Hundreds of organizations came together, just like we're doing right now, to commemorate the day and promote worldwide awareness of hunger. Today, it's our turn. Let us join together in common cause with moral conviction and a common spirit. Let us make a commitment that we will act. We will act to ensure that all people on this planet have access to healthy, nutritious food. We will act to begin building a future where no child goes to bed without a meal and no family experiences the pangs of hunger. We will act because we know that inaction is unacceptable and immoral. And so I call upon all of you to join our coalition of supporters for emergency food assistance and help us continue to build support in Congress and within the Biden administration to step up and to rally the international community to also step up. I believe that, like the old African saying, sticks in a bundle can't be broken, or the old saying that says, spider webs united can tie up a lion. I believe that when we come together and work together and stand together as humanity, there's no limits on what we can achieve. And the children we help today can help us lead to a brighter tomorrow for all of humanity. Thank you for your heart. Thank you for your head and your wisdom. Thank you for your conviction to join in this effort.
Thank you, Senator Booker, for that message and for your important work on these issues on Capitol Hill. Now I'd like to turn to our next set of remarks from General James Jones. He's also joining by video. General Jones serves as President, Chairman, and founder of Jones Group International, Chairman of the Scowcroft Center's Advisory Council, and previously served as U.S. National Security Advisor to U.S. President Obama. General Jones has been spearheading efforts to mobilize U.S. military and national security leaders to join the fight against hunger in order to contribute to a more secure world. After we hear from General Jones, we'll turn it over to Nicole Golden from Apt Associates and the Atlantic Council to moderate today's panel discussion.
Greetings. I wish I could be with you in person for this important forum. However, I'm in Europe fulfilling a pre-existing commitment and cannot be with you in person. I ask for this opportunity to thank the Atlantic Council, the Eleanor Crook Foundation, and our distinguished panel for spotlighting the importance of combating food insecurity and its most dire consequences, severe hunger and malnutrition. Assuring food security is more than a humanitarian imperative. It is central to global stability and U.S. national security. In every way, the cause is future defining. Food insecurity, extreme hunger, and malnutrition are grim components of today's threat dynamics, playing a role in mass migration, economic stagnation, insurgency, and instability that can burst into armed conflict at any moment. The trends are ominous. U.S. intelligence estimates warn that the overall risk of food insecurity in many countries of strategic importance to the United States will only increase, and in some cases will almost certainly contribute to social disruptions or large-scale political instability or conflict. Of course, the challenge grows more severe and more complex as we factor in the impacts of population growth, demographic shifts, climate change, and increased resource competition. So given these trends, hunger looks to become a more powerful and coercive weapon for exploitation by authoritarian regimes, international terrorist organizations, and insurgent groups. Look at Vladimir Putin's weaponization of food in his war on Ukraine, and to Africa, where terrorist groups leverage severe hunger for support and recruitment. Food pressures contributed significantly to sparking the civil war in Syria. The U.S. national security strategy gets it exactly right. These, and I quote, are not marginal issues that are secondary to geopolitics. They are at the very core of national and international security and must be treated as such, unquote. For this reason, the United States and our allies must prioritize campaign plans to promote the development of resilient food systems worldwide. And as part of this campaign, we must up our effort to fight the most present and pressing manifestation of extreme food insecurity, severe malnutrition, by helping the many millions of children experiencing or under threat of wasting and stunting from lack of food. This latter component is what we might think of as food insecurity's emergency room. We have a choice. We can expand access to proven cost-effective treatment to help vulnerable children survive, thrive, and contribute to stabler communities and more productive economies, or allow unnecessary suffering, death, and lifelong disability to take its grim toll on lives and on the resilience of at-risk societies. Given the security implications at stake, I'm pleased to announce that I'm helping organize a group of former senior retired military and national security officials to bring greater attention to these issues. A fuller understanding of the security implications of food security and malnutrition is necessary if we are to solve this monumental humanitarian challenge, and in so doing, advance global stability on which the cause of peace, development, and U.S. national security so heavily rely. The challenge is great, the opportunity is before us, and the time is now for U.S. and allied leadership to tackle this mission as if our future depends on it, because it does. Again, thank you for gathering today. We look forward to an expert discussion on issues vital to the core values and interests of the United States and allied democracies and our aspirations for a more peaceful, free, and humane world.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, Senator Booker. Thank you, General Jones, for really helping set the stage for this robust conversation that we really need to be having today on how global food and why food insecurity is really at the nexus of national security. And it's also an issue that from which you can really extricate the economics, as we've heard. On Monday, which was World Food Day, as the senator mentioned, I was traveling home from Marrakesh, where I was at the World Bank IMF annual meetings. And food security was very prominently on the agenda there, as both a result from and a contributing factor to conflict and instability. And those economic dynamics were really at play, and we were talking there about both the short-term and the long-term issues of food and as a resilience issue. The conversations underscored, and as we've heard, why we need to be having this conversation and why we need to be having it now amid the polycrises where national security, in which food is at the nexus. We're recovering from COVID, we've got climate change, we've got conflict, all putting a strain on fiscal management, on water and agricultural resources, on public systems and public services. We've heard some of the data, we've heard the alarming statistics. We're now looking at nearly 350 million people and facing severe acute food insecurity, and another 900 million facing hunger around the world, and that number is rising quickly. At least 60 million children, around the world suffering from malnutrition and wasting. And that number and intensity of climate shocks is growing, right? Whether that's drought, floods, heat waves that we're seeing around the world. The Famine Early Warning Systems Network has actually said that the current El Nino could push another 100 million people into the need for food assistance by early next year. As we've heard and as we know, the food security situation has been worsened by Russia's war in Ukraine, and in particular on the economic side, that's driven up as food supplies have been curtailed, it's driven up prices, and again, after the collapse of the Black Sea grain deal, we've seen that increase. One of the other pieces that we'll put into this conversation, and I hope we'll get to unpack a little bit more, is that we know that food insecurity, in addition to children, does not impact all people in the same way, in the sense that we have widening inequality. And we know that food insecurity is a particular issue for women, for people with disabilities, for people in rural areas, or increasingly in the cities who are maybe further from a natural food source. So all these factors are adding together to have widening inequality, mass migration, poverty, learning losses, and reduced economic opportunity in which malevolent actors can exploit that situation and increase for political strife, instability, insurgency. So the hard questions, as we're going to try to answer in a short period of time, is how urgent and more challenging is it to achieve global food security in this situation and reduce childhood malnutrition? And importantly, what is the solution set? So lucky for me, as you've heard, we've got 4 fantastic, truly distinguished experts to help answer, or at least start to. We may end up surfacing more questions than we actually have answers to. We've got Will Moore, he's the CEO of the Eleanor Crook Foundation. We have Johanna Mendelsohn-Foreman, another former collaborator of mine, I might add, a distinguished fellow at the Simpson Center's Managing Across Boundaries Initiative and an adjunct professor at SIS, School of International Service at American University. We're very honored to have Farah Barrios here. She's the Director for Global Food Security and Development Planning at the National Security Council at the White House. And of course, we are honored to have General William E. Kip Ward, former commander of United States Africa Command. So with that, let's get to it. Will, I'm going to come to you first. Can you shed a little more light on the malnutrition situation specifically? I don't think we necessarily hear enough about that crisis in the sense of the broader food security crisis.
Sure. I mean, I think you and some of the other speakers have already captured the macro picture pretty well. I actually think there are 2 pictures that are worth describing. The first one is actually a really nice, upbeat, beautiful picture. And that's of the trends on hunger and malnutrition over the last 30 years. Between 1990 and 2020, the world cut hunger and malnutrition in half. And actually between 2000 and 2020, we cut child deaths around the world in half. So we've seen a tremendous amount of progress in a very short period of time. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. And I think we should also remember that the United States played a really pivotal leadership role in those improving trends. They would not have happened without U.S. leadership. So that's the pretty picture. That's the 30-year picture. Now, the other picture is a much, much darker picture. And that's the picture of the last 3 years. Due to the poly crisis that's been referred to, due to what we often call the 3 C's of COVID, conflict, and climate change, we think we've lost about 10 to 20% of the progress made in the last 3 decades just in the last 3 years. And you heard some of those statistics. 345 million people this year facing acute food insecurity. That is double what we saw the year before the pandemic hit. We've got historic drought in East Africa, which has caused 1.3 million people to migrate in that region just last year. We're seeing 45 million people on the brink of famine across 43 countries. So you've got this instability really scattered across a lot of contexts. 50 million children suffering from wasting, essentially at risk of death from starvation. So we really are hanging by a thread in a lot of ways, and we are at a nexus moment, at a moment where we have to decide, do we want to double down on this progress and keep driving down this problem of global hunger and malnutrition, or are we going to turn our attention to other things? And I think most of us here would agree that that would be a very short-sighted decision, acknowledging the fact that there are a lot of pressing things going on. On the malnutrition front, the problem has gotten so bad that today malnutrition is the #1 killer of kids in today's world. 3 million kids die from malnutrition every year, more than tuberculosis, more than malaria, more than HIV, actually more than all 3 of those major killers combined. We've got a child dying from malnutrition every 11 seconds. And a lot of kids don't die, they survive, but they're still going to suffer lasting, permanent consequences. We see about 1 in 4 kids on Earth are permanently stunted, both cognitively and physically. You actually see it in population heights and lost IQ, and that is irreversible. So it's a dire picture, and I think as we're going to hear from folks with more impressive resumes than I have today, this is an issue that is directly driving instability and migration and conflict in our world. Most of these people who will not eat today, most of the parents of children who will die of starvation today, they live in the poorest and most marginalized communities on Earth. And so often those same places are the headwaters of conflict and violent extremism and migration. And we know that the world's bad actors do weaponize desperation. And when your child is hungry, nothing else matters.
I'm going to pick up on that. Thank you, Will, for really unpacking that situation for us that much more. And let me come to you, Farah, in terms of, hearing these numbers. You've been at this for a while. We've been, colleagues back in the day at USAID, and you were a real leader then. How does the administration currently see the interlock between the food security and national security issues, and why is it imperative?
It's been clear from the administration that food security is a critical issue. We've worked very closely with Will and his organization, and it's also been clear that the message has been, how do we work with everyone? This is the first time where you have individuals that are not only passionate on these issues, but working with the private sector, working with philanthropics, and also figuring out ways that are innovative, that really deal with the resilience component, and focusing on what are areas where we can work differently to be ahead of, or rather mitigate future shocks.
No, that's really important to hear. And with that, General Ward, let me come to you. Picking up on that and what we've heard, in what way is food security exploited by terrorist enterprises or criminal organizations, insurgents, and other than the critical humanitarian imperative? How does U.S. leadership on these issues, do you think, affect us as a nation geostrategically?
Well, first of all, the comments made by both Senator Booker and General Jones are absolutely spot on, and I couldn't have said anything better than them. And being here on this panel with these experts, I think I'm probably the odd person out, because those statistics are just so stark and striking. Mm-hmm. For me, seeing the impact in areas of operation has what caused me to be so dedicated to this fight against malnutrition and food security. We as a nation, as we attempt to ensure that our national security is at its highest level, must understand what's going on in other parts of the global commons that contribute to that insecurity. Without question, food is a tool that is used by bad actors, be they criminals, terrorists, and others, that traffickers who serve bad purposes and take advantage of a devastated population. And as was pointed out, nothing is more devastating than hunger and malnutrition. That becomes a driving force of your raison d'etre. And when you have groups who very willingly, purposely, in addition to what happens from the climatic scenarios that create these conditions, then come in and purposely do things to restrict, to withhold, to prevent access to food, then they can then use that as a tool to coerce, to influence their behavior, creating these conditions that are instability factors in nations where it exists, as well as nations where those people will try to escape that go with the migration impact. And that migration impact also creates instability in an otherwise potentially stable country. And so it's a multiplying impact that this has. And when it goes unchecked, it creates problems for not just the United States, not just a region or the country where this is going on, but for the global community, given where we are today with our collective security requirements. And so the United States, as we do what we do in our national interests, it's important that we would do that in a collaborative way, in a collective way, so that our efforts are tied to the efforts of the global population, the global community, in addressing this particular issue, so that populations 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 30 years from now, has the potential of being more able to contribute to a stable environment than not. And if food security is not addressed as a part of that equation, then we are quite candidly doing things that are irrelevant to our future security.
Thanks, General. And we're going to come back to some of those solutions parts in a moment. But before we do, Johanna, let me turn to you. You work on an issue that is across boundaries. So when you sort of look and survey this situation, how do you see food insecurity as a transnational issue, as a transnational threat, and how does that relate to our national security here in the U.S.? And sort of relatedly, how do you see the Ukraine and the Black Sea, the collapse of the Black Sea grain deal as a factor?
Well, I think we
just a short question.
Just a short question. Let me go back on something that Will said. There are 40 conflicts in the world which are directly tied to food insecurity. The World Bank's recent FY24 list of conflict countries in unstable, fragile states underscores that we have not solved a problem. 20 years ago, when I was working at the bank and also at USAID, these same countries appeared on the list. So I think it raises a question of how, because the United States can't do it alone, as good as our policy and our teams are internationally, we need to do this as a community. I think the good part on this, before I get to the Ukraine issue, because it's exactly 2 years ago that I was in the Ukraine today teaching food security to their foreign ministry, so it's kind of an irony that I'm here today and talking about it, is that we need to have, the whole of government is an important phrase, but actually how do we make it work? The Congress reauthorized the Global Food Security Act last year, which is an important step, but DOD is still missing from that act. And the question is, we can't do this in separate tracks. I'm sure the General could speak as a person who works on the ground in all these areas of operations, which are the most crisis-driven countries. So I think the challenge is how we work on this together, because each of the agencies brings value added to solving these problems. But 40 conflicts, they're the same ones. There's nothing new. So why aren't we solving it? To Ukraine and the Russian deal, first of all, let's get back to the World Food Program. 80% of the grain that it purchases comes out of the Ukraine, and that region is suffering. Now, The Ukrainians, being very smart and clever, have figured out alternate routes. They use rails and they use the Danube to get the grain out. It's not a perfect solution because these fields have been mined, and we're going to have a massive demining problem after this war is ended, hopefully soon. So that's something we need to talk about, because it's not a pretty picture as to what's going to happen in the most fertile land, which has been in contest since the First World War as far as breadbaskets. The other thing that's interesting is we still have other kinds of crises that are related to this, because our greatest challenge in competition with China is food exports. China is the biggest importer of food in the world. A lot of this food is coming from this region. We need to address how food is going to be accessed over the long term, and this war does not help the situation. The other question is fertilizer. The pipeline that the fertilizer flows through, which goes through Ukraine, by the way, as a geopolitical issue, is not being used. It is being cut off. So, and that's the Ukrainians' decision, but we could get into that. We need to address the access to fertilizer, because you can't grow large-scale crops without fertilizer. So all of this has a major impact, and I'm sure we can come back to this. But there are so many issues that we could relate to.
Absolutely, and you mentioned, the World Bank and some of the issues on Ukraine. I mean, one of the other impacts that we've seen, which is again contributing to this sort of immediacy of this crisis, is that in response, and this was actually just last week's reporting out of the World Bank, is that currently almost 20 countries, 19 to be exact, have implemented 27 different export bans, right? They're trying to, in response to the food shortage issues and supply issues, shoring up their kind of domestic production and protection. And so that is also keeping prices really high, not only of food, but as you say, of the other inputs, fertilizer, right, fuel, and energy. So on that, I do want to get into solutions, because we have such limited time. Yeah.
A fifth of the world's population gets its calories from rice, and the price of rice has skyrocketed,
in part
causing tremendous disasters around the world.
Absolutely, and we're going to come back to that. Farah, let me turn back to you here as we start talking about the solution set. Last year, the administration released its global food security strategy, focusing on integrated approaches through the Feed the Future initiative, which you were such a part of spearheading. As an evidence-based strategy, right, what have been the key interventions? Where is the strategy now, and how are you seeing it going forward?
Now that we've launched that particular global food security strategy, we've really tried to pull together the entire U.S. Government in terms of really honing in on how do we actually address fertilizer inputs, structural issues such as supply chains, and also really thinking about what are countries most lacking. Some of it, for example, is credit or access to credit. Some of it is also really honing in on how are we actually addressing certain populations, and also really thinking through what are areas that we could really bolster. We're still working very closely with leaders within Africa, leaders within Latin America, and being more prescriptive of how we can work together, but also working with our partners that implement many of these great ideas. So we've been working very closely on how do we hone that in. Is the answer, that we are done? We are not done. So from that perspective, we've been really laser focused on how do we accelerate our progress on food security, and specifically, also thinking about trade, and how do we encourage other partners to not restrict their exports and not extend any bans. So we've been working very closely on those issues, and we still have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. At APT, we are an implementer of Feed the Future programs, and we've really seen how working through the market system, as you mentioned, whether that's on credit, whether that's working with the private sector and different market actors, is really critical to sort of working at that systems level, and I'm sure hopefully we'll have others comment on that. And you mentioned the trade piece, and we're going to come back to that, but I'd be remiss if I didn't give a quick mention to a little shameless plug. I have a new paper out with colleagues in the Geoeconomics Center on economic statecraft, and positive economic statecraft is one of the frameworks that we talk about with respect to food in particular in bringing together the different tools that we have in the government. And with that, let me come to you, General Ward. And as you said, the military does have a distinct role in advancing in food security, yet it's also among the issues where a 3D approach to development, diplomacy, defense, and interagency coordination, as Farah mentioned, is really needed. So sort of a two-part question for you. What kinds of specific activities can or should the military undertake in advancing food security or mitigating malnutrition? And from your perspective and experience, what has worked well in coordination, and where is there still space for improvement?
Well, thanks for that. That's a wonderful, for me, an exciting proposition. In 2007, when we established the United States Africa Command, folks don't realize it today, but at that point in time, we put forth the notion of the 3Ds. And the genesis was there because soldiers on the ground, airmen on the ground, Marines on the ground, Coast Guardsmen, civilians said, hey, this environment requires a level of coordination and synchronization but for that coordination and synchronization, what we do as a defense force won't have long-term sustainability. So therefore, how do we partner with our other interagency friends such that our collective effort makes a difference? And so the 3D notion was born then because we saw it, if other things aren't happening, what we do, we settle for a moment, but that's a very expensive proposition that really can't be sustained. So once conditions are created that will allow something to happen, what else is going on that will then take it to the next level, to the sustaining level? And that's where our interagency partners came to play. And so we were very focused and deliberate in reaching out to the Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Department of Treasury, such that things that were being done by those activities were at best not being hampered by what we did, but in a good case scenario, made even more effective because of our efforts to reinforce what was going on there. And because of our ability to help create conditions that would then allow those things to move forward. Not that we would do those things, not at all, but help to create the conditions that will allow those things to move forward in some positive, sustainable ways. And so for me, and for most of my now colleagues and counterparts who see that and understand that we know that it requires more than our presence. Not that our presence isn't needed, because we have to be there, but it cannot be just us. And so we want others, our friends and partners who have the expertise, who understand what it means to produce a drought-resilient seed so that a crop is, in fact, able to be harvested because the water shortage might exist, or be more resistant to some disease. I attended the Borlaug dialogue in Des Moines a few years ago and talked about this very same thing, and I speaking to those who brought forward ideas and how we then implement those on the ground. And when you get on the ground and those who are there working, be it a unit commander from one of the military units, be it one of the program directors from our various agencies, their dialogue, okay, we're doing this, but if you do that, it might make this not work so well. But you have any alternatives? Yes, we can do it this way. Okay, do it like that, because then we are supporting each other's efforts and endeavors. That on-the-ground coordination works. I've seen it work. I know it works. And if you have umbrella policies that are being established, they become less effective if the coordination and synchronization isn't happening at echelon continually in a sustained, focused, and very deliberate and intentional way. And that's where I see our progress that can be made. And it's never too late to do that, because the suffering that goes on when it's not happening is there. As was pointed out, we revisit this, we revisit it, we revisit it. We stop revisiting it if we attack it in a very coordinated, focused, synchronized way so that all entities are involved, the 3Ds are engaged. And the combatant commands in today's environment have taken that lesson. We were able to cause it to be something. Let's realize that, because soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, quite frankly, we don't want to just keep shooting. We want other things to work so that that shooting doesn't have to continue so we can move forward.
Thank you for that, and it comes back to that strategy being so critical to help bring that policy coherence. But let me come to Johanna now on that. And you talked about the 3Ds. Johanna, you've written about soft power. Is food security a soft power issue? Or picking up on what the general said, what does that mean for the balance of interventions? How do you think about your work in culture and education and sort of bringing that set of tools to this issue?
Well, historically, the United States has used food as a soft power instrument. When the Cold War began, we created Food for Peace, which was an effort to provide commodities, which also benefited the U.S. commodity industry and still does. And that's not wrong. I just say that that's the way we work. But food has also become apparent in the consciousness of those who have to implement this policy, that it has a piece of hard power. It can be used kinetically, as we've seen tragically in Syria, we've seen tragically in the Ukraine situation when food is weaponized. I think the positive thing is that culturally, and even a country like Ukraine included, food is a part of its cultural projection in its national security strategy, because it sees that people have a positive interest. And Kafka always said, when you sit around the table, you don't fight. Now, I don't know about that, but when you have no bread, you have no peace. And I think we've also seen the other side of the coin. So what's important is that it's both tools. And now that we are in this new Cold War situation, I think food becomes even more vital to talk about in terms of what Farah was saying, and resilience of this interagency connectivity of what Will is doing with nutrition, because it's whole. And the good thing about the connectivity of food and soft power is that because there is a linkage with climate and food, and they're no longer treated as separate tracks by the IPCC, we can make progress, because we recognize that things that are affected by drought or by weather conditions are also going to have food ramifications. There was a Norwegian study which said that climates with an 8 degrees Celsius warmer climate are more inclined to conflict. We know that drier countries are also more inclined to conflict. So we have some data, and I think going forward, which is what I think you're looking for, is that we need to get the data, and we have capacity to do data, so that we can be prevention focused as opposed to it, and that's part of soft power, which is non-kinetic responses.
Absolutely, and your point about, again, this integration, that's really what was on the surface in Marrakesh last week.
I'm sure.
The World Bank new mission, ending poverty on a livable planet, right? And it's bringing in the health, the environment, and all of that together. So Will, with that, let me come to you, back to you. Your organization has been on the front lines of the fight against malnutrition and wasting in particular. And I'd love to hear more of some of the specific interventions that you see as part of that solution set in this broader context. And where's been the U.S. on this, and where do we, together with our allies, really need to think differently and act differently?
Yeah, I mean, the solution set is quite clear. We have 30 years of pretty good data on the malnutrition side about what really works. What can, if you implement this intervention, will it measurably reduce rates of severe malnutrition in a given context?
Right?
At scale.
Because that's key. The numbers that we've been talking about are staggering.
Absolutely key if we want to really make a dent in this issue. And we really believe that because this is such a crisis moment, that we do need to start by focusing on those most proven cost-effective interventions that will have an immediate tangible effect. We commissioned Johns Hopkins University a few years ago to look at the evidence and to look across contexts and interventions and say, in contexts where we see really high rates of child death from severe malnutrition, what are the very most proven cost-effective scalable interventions to address the problem? And when they looked, 4 interventions really stood out across, above the rest and across contexts. And those are 4 interventions we're very focused on at the foundation that the sector now refers to as the Power 4. Very simple, proven interventions that we could scale tomorrow, but coverage rates of them are terrible, and that is primarily an investment and a prioritization issue. The first one, before a child's even born, making sure moms have access to prenatal vitamins. It's something that probably every mom in this room, every mom in rich countries is going to have access to, is going to take. In poor countries, almost all moms do not have access to these prenatal vitamins. It's $2 a pregnancy. It is one of the best buys in global health for the survival of the child, for the health of the mother, and for a child's chance at thriving in later life. The second of the 4 is breastfeeding support. Basic breastfeeding support, talking to moms about the importance of breastfeeding, how to breastfeed. It's known as a child's first vaccine. Again, tremendously life-saving and important for setting a child up for success in life. Third of the 4, vitamin A supplementation. Most people haven't heard of this one unless you work in public health, but it's 2 drops of vitamin A on a kid's tongue. They only need it about twice a year for the first 2 years of life. In contexts where we see a lot of severe malnutrition and child death, if you get that vitamin A to them twice a year, we see a 27% reduction in all-cause mortality in these contexts, just from that one intervention. And then the fourth, the final one, if those preventative interventions fail and a child does succumb to severe malnutrition, making sure that they have access to treatment with ready-to-use therapeutic foods so that at least they don't die. And this is what a sachet of ready-to-use therapeutic food looks like. It's a medical food product. We believe this is really the most important place to start right now. It costs $1 a day to treat a kid. In just a matter of weeks, you will see that child who is skin and bones on the edge of death recover to full health. Over 90% of kids recover. But we only reach 1 in 4 kids who are severely malnourished. We've got 50 million kids in the world today who need this product. We only reach about 1 in 4 of them with it. The cost to reach the rest is $950 million a year. That's essentially $950 million a year is what it would cost to live in a world where children no longer starve to death, where the 1 million kids a year who die of wasting, almost all of them will survive if we spend that $950 million a year. We could write the check, and in 6 months' time, we could be reaching almost all of those children. The frameworks are in place, the production capacity is in place. To put that in perspective, I mean, that is half of what Americans spent on Taylor Swift concert tickets just this year. And they're going to spend a lot more than that, too, before the year's over. It's about the annual operating revenue of a mid-sized U.S. hospital. That's the cost to live in a world where kids don't die of starvation.
Thank you so much, Will. And I'm really glad you brought up the health side of the intervention space. I think in the food security, we spend a lot of time, with good reason, on the agriculture side, on thinking about climate-smart agriculture, on building resilience, on markets, as I said. But as you said, it starts on the prevention side with health. And I think, the senator mentioned in his remarks the supplemental and the Ukraine supplemental funding. And we've seen how that has enabled more integration. I've seen it, for example, we have a large program on health service delivery in the DRC, and with supplemental funding have been able to expand that and shift into work in more nutrition-oriented programming to help bring that link into food security. So I think it's really critical, and I'm glad you shed some light on what are those really specific interventions. We are, of course, coming short on time. So with that, I just want to kind of go back and give you all a chance to have a sort of final word before I turn it over to Will to close us out. To what I said before in the opening about inclusion. And we know that in addition to children and in certain regions, food insecurity disproportionately impacts different populations. And at the same time, we've heard how working with the private sector and other actors is really critical to think about the sustainability and working with local communities and partners on the ground can contribute to the sustainability of these efforts. So as a closing word, would love, and we'll start with you and come down the line this way, a final thought as it relates to inclusion, sustainability, and where you would like to see this conversation go forward, because it is an ongoing conversation and we've just scratched the surface today.
I'd say where I'd love to see it go moving forward, focusing on the things that we know work, the things that are on the shelf that we are not deploying. Again, the things we could do tomorrow that would make a big difference that we're not doing today. In terms of inclusion, I absolutely agree with you, and I still spend a fair amount of time in places where we see really high rates of extreme food insecurity, of child deaths from malnutrition and starvation. In almost all of those places, even in a lot of these places are in stable countries, but they're in regions of those countries where there's a long history of marginalization. In northern Nigeria or northern Uganda or parts of northern Kenya, where there are tribal tensions, there are ethnic tensions, there is a history of political marginalization that a lot of folks just don't know about. But so often, that's at the heart of what we're seeing, is that even in these contexts, you don't have governments caring about the people in these places.
Thanks. I'm really glad you brought it up. I mean, we see that food insecurity is actually a leading cause of poverty in wealthier nations as well, right? And I think we can look in our own backyards here. Johanna, final
Just a
word.
quick thing, because we haven't mentioned gender, but the majority of people who are migrants are women and children.
Absolutely.
The victims of war are women and children. If you look at the refugees in Ukraine, the refugees that come out of Venezuela, even in the dry corridors in Central America, it's the women and the children who suffer for a variety of societal inequities that we are not the fault of, but actually they become the victims. So I think we need to incorporate this. I think we put a lot of good rhetoric into it, but we need to put it into practice. The real victims, in addition to the infants and children, are the women and children in these situations.
Absolutely. I mean, we know that the inflation that has been both a cause of and a factor of insecurity tends to infect women disproportionately. The women spend a larger share of their income on food. Right, so there's price hikes, and they're also a larger share of the agricultural workforce.
Right,
so
farmers.
They really are at the heart of it. General Ward?
Yeah, this is really great, and I'm going to take a bit longer time because what you just said, Joanna, is so that women and children suffer more. Women ought to be more involved in the solutions as well.
Yeah.
Because it is in these societies. Quick example. I won't name the country in Africa. I visited the country, and I went to a USAID project, and she was trying to grow enough food to feed her family, have enough to sell to send her children to school, and then whatever was left over was there. But she needed better irrigation. And I had one of my young Army sergeants who knew water and flow work with her. I go back and visit 5 months later. Not only is she growing enough food to feed her family, she has enlisted a little community, a little co-op. 8 other ladies have came together. They're growing food. They're being able to sell some of it. And she said to me, General, and my little son there, he won't be a terrorist because we're taking care of him now. The impact of that is so critical. Now, I only knew it because, one, I had worked with the USAID. I knew where their programs were. I wanted to go see. And our mantra was, how can we add value? At a minimum, do no harm, but add value to what you're doing so that collectively it's making a difference. And I believe that partnering, understanding what's important to them, not what we tell you is going to be important, but listening to them. What will it take for you to do what you need to do, be it some protection, be it some enhancement of some system, and then ensuring that what we do, there's a transfer of knowledge and skills so that when we're gone, they can continue that on and still thrive in a way that was different than what was before. And that would have left our position better because the threat of that family being taken over by some nefarious actor that can hold something over their head have been taken off the table.
Thanks, General, for a positive and uplifting anecdote. And Farah, I'm going to come to you for the last one.
I'm going to try to
Please do.
tack on to that positivity. And I would just say that it's really about inclusivity and working with really great partners. We can't do it alone. We don't expect to. And we have done really great work thus far, not only through Feed the Future, but also thinking holistically to the entire U.S. government. And just echoing what my colleagues have already mentioned, we have really great work to do.
Thank you so much, Farah. And on that note about partnership, let me invite Will, the partner for this event, and thank my panel. These are fantastic. And Will, over to you for some final words.
Well, want to thank everybody for coming and listening in. I'm really encouraged by the conviction and also the alignment across speakers today about the importance of this issue, and I think some of the best solutions at hand. At the Eleanor Crook Foundation, our goal is to live in a world where severe malnutrition is a relic of history, not an ongoing global crisis. And we really believe we can do this together. I mean, we've gotten halfway there in the last 30 years. We can get the second half of the way there if we really want to in the coming decades. We will continue to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in our own resources to scale up the most proven, cost-effective, scalable resources. And we're excited to work with new partners to get there, because it really will take all hands on deck. It will take the 3Ds and everything else that we have that we can throw at this problem. And that is why I am so encouraged by what we heard here today, by General Jones's new initiative, by the thought leadership at the Atlantic Council, and by the wise words from today's speakers. Meanwhile, a child continues to die of malnutrition every 11 seconds. Every life matters, and every death is a tragedy that is deeply, deeply felt by parents and communities. And it's really very simple at the end of the day. As long as families can't put food on the table, as long as thousands of children are dying of starvation each and every day, we will never live in a peaceful world. Thanks.